The other day, I was looking for an image of that really old, cringe gamer meme t-shirt. You know the one. It says, "I'm not a gamer because I have no life, but because I choose to have many." And it's got pictures of random, bland video game protagonists. I figured that this would be a relatively simple thing to find, and so I just pumped up Google search without any protection, and before I knew it, the worst thing imaginable had happened to my computer. I had accidentally navigated to Reddit. I left fairly quickly, but before doing so, a post caught my eye, and it has unfortunately wormed its way into my brain and been stuck there for the better part of 3 days. Somebody made a post comparing the reasons that people join your army in Engage to the Binding Blade. The obvious intent behind the post was to criticize the Lord and Retainer structure that was omnipresent in both Fates and Engage. This is a criticism of the games that I generally agree with, but as the saying goes, there's nothing worse than an ally who argues your point poorly. And God, this post was awful. It was so clearly weighted against Engage, merging not only the Retainers, but also people who are just soldiers, such as Saphir and Linden, into a single group labeled Knights/Retainers. And also included some questionable examples, like counting Mavier as a Retainer and Vale as a Lord, which I can see the argument for, but since they don't fall into the one Lord, two Retainers show up at the same time structure, I also think it misses the point of the criticism. In contrast, the Binding Blade had Knights and Retainers divided into 5 different categories. Roy's Retainers, Lalena's Retainers, Guinevere's Retainers, and Etrurian Knights were each given their own category, and other categories were needlessly split as well. What is the legitimate difference between persuaded and joined for their own benefits? And for that matter, why does Nime need her own category of here to fight dragons? Isn't that also something that's her own benefit? Like, I am of the belief that the Lords and Retainers thing is a real issue in Fates and Engage, and you don't need to make a fake list to make the point. I'm not the only one who made this observation. Most of the comments were clowning on OP, but a pattern that I saw was people taking this as evidence that the Lord and Retainer problem has always been a thing, and it's not really that much more extreme in Engage than it is in older Fire Emblems. My instinct is to disagree with this, but I did want to take a look through the series and observe the reasons that people join your army to see if there is any merit to the claim that Lords and Retainers have always been an omnipresent force. And while we're there, we might as well talk about why I find the Lords and Retainers pattern to be so annoying in modern FE. Okay, let's start with Arcanea. I'm using the DS remakes simply because they add new characters but don't take any away, and none of the motivations significantly change. Some of the writing is cleaned up since we only have a fan translation of FE1 and FE3, but overall I think it would be kind of redundant to just go over each Arcanea game separately. So instead, here we have FE11. As you can see, the majority of units in your army are either people who start out as part of Marth's army or Naya's army, because the two armies merged together. Like Hardin's squad, the Wolf Guard, are all just members of Naya's army. It makes sense that they would join your army when you ally with them. There's also a lot of people who are just mercenaries hired to work for you. I put Castor in this category as well. Technically, he could fit into Sheeta Convinces, but Sheeta does offer to pay him, and I think that that is the primary reason for him joining. Like, he wants money for his quote-unquote sick grandmother. There's also a few people who only join you because you save them. Maria is a hostage who you rescue, and that's why Minerva and the White Wings join you as well. Lena and Julian are running away from the thieves and the soothsayers. Ricardo and Zane are broken out of jail, and Tiki is broken out of hypnosis by Bantu. Technically, Linde could also be put in this category since you do save her from the slave markets, but I put her into Hates Garnef/Medius because she is ultimately just trying to get revenge for her father's death, which I believe is closer to the motivation that Tiki, Gotu, and Nagi have. There are also a couple of people who join just because someone in your army is their friend or family. Merrick joins because he's Marth's friend, Mathis joins because he's Lena's brother, and Astrum joins because he's Medea's husband, although arguably he could also have fit into Naya's knights as part of the category. The last two categories of units are just kind of weird. There's 4 people who Sheeta convinces to join you just because it's the right thing to do. That being Nabarl, Jake, Lawrence, and Roger, who arguably isn't with you for the right reasons just because he wants to fuck Marth's wife. And then there's a lot of people who just sort of join you just cuz. Riss has the famous line of, "Let me come with you, you won't be sorry that you did," and this is the most obvious, no explanation for the unit being your army moment, but there's quite a few others. Daros is the one who comes closest to giving a real reason. He just says he wants to make up for the fact that he was a pirate and he doesn't want to do evil anymore, but I don't really see the logical leap from that to joining Marth's army and personal campaign. Beck, Aaron, and Samson similarly just join you without really giving any explanation as long as you visit their village. Aaron and Samson seem to be more convinced with explaining that you can only pick one of them, rather than justifying why they choose to go with you. And most of the new characters added in the FE11 remake don't have an explanation for why they join you. They're just sort of doing the right thing so they join your army. Or else they're doing the wrong thing, but then you don't kill them, so they join your army. It's whatever. The Arcanea games are not supposed to be super in-depth story, so not having a complete explanation for everyone who joins you doesn't really surprise me. I mean, this is a game that originated on the NES, and the remake was on a mobile console. There's limitations. Since Mystery of the Emblem is a direct sequel to Marth's first adventure and features almost entirely the same cast, it makes sense that a lot of the people who join your army are going to be allies from the previous game. That being said, it is incredibly comical just how often at the beginning of a chapter, apropos of nothing, you'll have someone from the previous game show up and be like, "Yo, Marth, it's me, Dolph from FE11. I'm your ally. I'm here now." By my count, there were 30 characters who fit that category, and an additional 13 who were simply in your army because they're a part of Marth's army. And it's not like everyone who was in the previous games has to just show up with no explanation. Astrum and George are on the other side of the conflict, working for King Hardin, but are able to be convinced to defect to you for one reason or another. In fact, there are quite a few former allies who defect from Hardin's army, and most of them have a pretty good explanation for it. We also once again have Linda and the Dragons, who are working with you to help defeat Garneth and Medius. Sirius and Mathis, who are only working with you to rescue the maidens that Medius has captive, and a smattering of people who you rescue along the way, such as Minerva or Medea. Overall, I can't say I'm too happy for the majority of the explanations for people joining your army. SOV also doesn't fare much better on the uniqueness front. Alm's story involves him and several of his friends joining the Deliverance, so it makes sense that the majority of people in Alm's army are Alm's friends and the Deliverance at large. Celica's side is the same way, with most of her companions just being her friends. Although she does hire a couple of mercenaries, and there are some people who tag along with her because they want revenge on the thieves that she's fighting. Both armies do also rescue several damsels because this is the misogyny game, so we have to have women be captive. For FE4's list, I did not include any of the substitute characters since their reason for joining your army is identical to the person that they're substituting, and I didn't want any categories to look artificially bloated as a result of this. As you can see, in the first generation of the game, the majority of characters are either allied lords or retainers of those lords. There's also Edain, her sister, and 4 people that are in love with her. There are a smattering of people with more complex motivations. Ira is trying to protect her nephew and figure out what's going on with the larger war against Isaac. Lex is there to support his best bud Azel. Claude gets a vision at the tower which tells him where he needs to go, and Holland just joins you because you beat him in the arena and he was impressed, I guess. Okay, I guess they're not all the most complex motivations. Generation 2 does a very similar thing to Generation 1. Selith's revolution has a bunch of foot soldiers in the army alongside a bunch of allied lords. Arthur joins because he's looking for his sister, and Hannibal joins because you rescued his son. You could definitely criticize the game for not giving people enough varying reasons for joining your army, but honestly, fighting against an evil cult that's going to destroy the entire world with the Antichrist is reason enough to convince most people. And that same theme follows into FE5. Leif is leading his own revolution, and there are various smaller revolutions that join up with him. The Fianna Freeblades, the Magi, the Free City of Tara, and Selith's revolution, all combined together to form portions of Leif's army. There are also several people who join your army because you rescue them or a member of their family, which is common enough in Fire Emblem at this point. While technically Sarah might not seem like someone you rescue, she was implied to be going to be sacrificed to become a dead lord based on the fact that's what happens to her if you don't recruit her, so I count her among this number. Same with Alfred and Olwen. Alfred was left out just to be fodder for Leif's army, and Olwen was rescued from the dungeons of Kemp's fortress. There are also a plethora of people who just join because of one of the women in your army being attractive. Dean's case isn't so much attraction as loyalty, but I think he's supposed to be in love with Linowen, and everyone else is just like, ooga booga woman. Much like with people you rescue, this is a common thing in Fire Emblem, and I'll be honest, I don't love it. It just leans into some weird and annoying gender stuff. The last placement that I probably have to explain myself for is Salem and Trude being put into Retainer, but their joining is almost entirely just because their boss Parn joins you. Technically, Salem joins before Pern, and if you kill off Pern, Salem stays a part of your army, but he joins in order to try to convince you to get Pern on your side. So I would say that his motivation for joining your army does fit the Pern retainer role. Similar to the other games that we've talked about, the majority of your forces in FE6 are either retainers to the three main lords, Roy, Guinevere, and Lelina, or members of an allied faction. Specifically the Etrurian army, the Church of Elmine, or the revolutionaries on the Western Isles. These forces are then supplemented by several hired mercenaries, but there are also a good deal of cast members who join for their own reasons. Rutger hates Byrne because of what they did to the people of Sakai. In Nabata, you meet a crew of people who are here to fight against the War Dragons. Gonzalez was essentially sent out on a suicide mission until Lelina was kind to him. And, of course, because it's Fire Emblem, we have a couple of women who were damseled as well. There's also a good deal of folks who join just because they know someone in your army. And I think because of all of these people, it feels like you're leading a ragtag squad rather than a singular army united behind its own force. Fear is kinda just here because Noah was nice to her one time. Zeus is here because his sister is lesbians with one of the main lords. Chad and Lou want revenge for the orphanage that got burned down, and Ray just tags along because he's friends with them from back when they lived in the orphanage. And that ragtag group of friends feeling is even more extreme as we move into Fire Emblem 7, especially if you bear Lin mode in mind. You get some fun situations like Sarah nagging Urk into joining your army, or the hired mercenaries turning out to be led by Wrath, who is a familiar face if you played through Lin's story. But when you get down to it, a large number of the cast are either soldiers working under Hector, Eliwood, and Lin, or mercenaries hired by them. Or in the case of Dorcas, Bartray, and Rebecca, they're kind of just volunteers. I put them in hired merc because they're functionally the same way, but they did volunteer to help Eliwood without any compensation, which, I don't know, not the wisest financial move. Maybe Farina's brain is in the right place. There are, of course, a smattering of people who are fighting against the Black Fang unrelated to Eliwood's crusade. Pent, Athos, and Louise know that Nurgle is up to no good, and so they and Hawkeye are roped into the fight for that reason. Karel is just sort of here to kill people, and the Black Fang features some people that he can kill. Not really that deep of a motivation on this one. Vida wants to protect Zephiel. Renault has a deep and complicated backstory contained within supports you are never going to see, and Jafar, Nino, and Legault all abandon the Black Fang, Legault because it's corrupted, and Jafar and Nino in order to save Nino's life. This is probably the most varied set of motivations in the entire franchise. While I do still think it would be accurate to say the majority of the people are just there because they're part of Eliwood's army, you've also got people like Canas, who are giving Rhys a run for his money in terms of no explanation joining. Moving on to the Sacred Stones, we once again have a large number of people who are just soldiers or royals from allied nations, and that includes the retainers to Erica and Ephraim. There's also a good deal of folks who are just here to fight monsters, nothing too much more than that. And as is tradition, there are a smattering of people you rescue who join your army as a result of this. Dussel, Cormag, and Noel also eventually end up betraying Grado after they realize that the country is too far gone and is doing plenty of evil deeds, including killing Cormag's brother. Lastly, we have Colm, who joins because of Naomi, Joshua, who joins because of Natasia, and Renak, who joins because of La Rochelle. There are a couple of characters on the list who could be moved to a different location for spoiler reasons, but because I don't want to spoil the story of Sacred Stones in this video, I figured that I would just leave them in the initial reason that they present for joining your army instead of the real secret ones. In Path of Radiance, you control Ike, the leader of a band of mercenaries, who is hired by Elincia, the leader of Crimea. A large amount of your forces are made up of the Grail mercenaries, or other people who Ike hires the services of. Beyond that, soldiers from Gallia, Begnion, and Crimea join you in your fight. There's also, as always, people who you rescue who end up joining you as a result of that, and people who know someone in your army. Ileana knows the merchants, Har knows Jill, Taronio knows Ike's dad, Largo knows Khalil, Makalov knows his sister, and Nasir knows someone who's a bit of a story spoiler, so again, I'll leave that out. There's a few people who join because the army you're fighting against is racist, and then there's Soth, who just exists for sequel bait. Like, he's not even a good enough unit to justify his inclusion. He is just there to hint at Radiant Dawn. And speaking of Radiant Dawn, partially due to that story's structure, the majority of the people you control are just working for whatever army you happen to be heading up at the time. Are you controlling the Grail mercenaries? Well then, congratulations. It's the Grail mercs or the armies they've been hired by. Are you controlling the Dawn Brigade? Then congratulations. It's the Dawn Brigade and the Dane army. During part 4, the threat becomes apocalyptic, and as a result, some people who would not have otherwise joined your forces end up doing so. There are very few exceptions to this rule. Aaron joins your army because he knows Laura and she's already a part of the Dawn Brigade. Har ends up joining up with Elincia just because he knows Marcia. And Soth is able to convince Tormod, Muaram, and Vika because of his friendship with Tormod from Path of Radiance. And, of course, Heather joins just because Pretty Woman. Because, you know, we gotta keep that old Fire Emblem tradition going. At least her presentation is much closer to Roger's silliness and foolishness than it is Pern's pure creepiness. Moving on to Awakening, and I feel like I'm repeating myself, but hey, it looks like the majority of the Gen 1 units are either already members of the Shepherds or Crom's larger army, or else work in one of the armies that you ally with. The second generation is also made up of the children of Gen 1, and all of them traveled back in time in order to save the world after the apocalypse. In following with Fire Emblem tradition, there's a fair number of people who join just because you saved them, and that includes Robin, the game's avatar. Chrom just finds her lying on the ground, and she's like, okay, well, I guess I'm sticking with y'all for the rest of my life now. There are also 4 people who don't reasonably fit into any of these categories. Gaius, who joins because Chrom has candy in his pocket, Pawn, who joins because she's the last Tagul alive, and that's the only explanation she gives. Tharja, who joins because she's obsessed with Robin in a really creepy and weird way. And Henry, who joins because... I don't actually know why Henry joins, actually. He just sort of is like, hey, you know, let me make a crow pun, and I like murdering people. Why the fuck is Henry here? Oh, whatever, let's move on to Fire Emblem Fates, because to my knowledge, this is where the complaint about Lords and Retainers originated, and I can see why. Both Hoshido and Nor had 4 sublords, and each of these sublords had 2 retainers. As a result, it does kind of feel like the majority of your army falls into this pattern. Beyond that, there are characters who don't technically fall into the retainer role in Silas, Kaze, and Gunter, yet they are so close with Corrin that many people refer to them as Corrin's retainers. And of the few non-retainer units that we get, many of them are Corrin sexual. Shura, Reyna, Scarlet, Izana, Fuga, and Gunter all lack supports with characters other than the Avatar. Well, technically, Fuga and Gunter have 1 non-Corrin support each, but you get what I mean. This pattern is definitely made the most explicit on the Revelations route because there are multiple points in the story where you just get fed a large chunk of characters due to the fact that they are a lord and their retainers. The most explicit example of this is when Xander and Leo show up and drag their 4 shitters along with them, but Sakura also has a squad with her, Takumi's squad all shows up at the same time, Camilla's squad all shows up at the same time. It is a very noticeable and repetitive pattern. I don't really feel like I need to talk too much about Three Houses. Because of that game's structure, the majority of the people in your army are students, and the ones that are not are either teachers or knights. Or Cyril, I guess. Cyril gets to be his own special category. He doesn't really fall into faculty, but he's also definitely not a student. He's just here to grill. And that brings us to Engage, which much like Fates had 8 sublords, each of whom had 2 retainers. I made 2 separate lists because you could technically argue that Ivy and Hortensia, as well as their retainers, fit into the turncoats category, but I also understand why people lump them in with the allied lords. After all, each country has 2 lords, and each lord has 2 retainers. It's a simple pattern. Either way, as you can clearly see, the majority of characters fall into the lord and retainer pattern, with only 8 who are definitely not a part of it. But is this problem really so exclusive to Engage? 8 characters with their own reasons is more than Awakening and Fates have. It's more than Radiant Dawn and Fire Emblem 4 have. A lot of people are just in the army or mercenaries who are hired out, and this has been the case throughout all of Fire Emblem. So why do people specifically focus this criticism on Engage and to a lesser extent Fates? Well, partially it's just because this is the internet, and hating on the most recent game in the franchise is just what you do. I remember when Fates first released and everyone shit on it. Then SOV came out and it was the worst Fire Emblem ever. Then Three Houses came out and it had its own controversies, and now it's Engage's turn in the shitter. But I also do think there is a legitimate argument to be made that recruitment has gotten a lot more boring over the past couple of entries in Fire Emblem. Some of the older FE games had really iconic recruitment scenarios. To veterans, getting Joshua is not that difficult, but to newer players, realizing that you have to bring your defenseless cleric in to talk to this scary mercenary with a strong killing weapon, it makes for a memorable gameplay moment, and is much more impactful than just having Diamant and Amber show up and be like, yo, we're your guys now. But that isn't a problem exclusive to the Lord and Retainer pattern. In The Binding Blade, Igrin just sort of shows up at the start of Chapter 15. In Radiant Dawn, the Hawks join your army during the swamp map, with no special fanfare, they're just here. Conversely, the Lord and Retainer showing up can make for memorable gameplay experiences on their own. Everyone loves to gush about Conquest Chapter 10 and how memorable it is as one of the best defend maps in the franchise. And personally, I think one of the things that makes that map so memorable is that on turn 3, just as you start feeling overwhelmed, Camilla and her 2 retainers show up, and they are a very welcome sight for your stretched thin army. In Fire Emblem Engage, Chloe and Louis are separated from the rest of your forces when you first meet up with them, and Celine is equipped with a ring that lets her warp over to assist her retainers. Jade also begins her map in danger, and you have to rush to try to recruit her before she suicides with Green Unit AI, deciding that an Armor Knight should in fact attack the mages. The bigger problem isn't that the characters are all lords and retainers, but simply that outside of these 2 examples, there's not really any exciting recruitment scenarios. Fogado, Pandreo, and Bunet are just sort of there. Tamara, Panette, and Marin are just sort of there. Even in the instance where the story would kind of suggest there should be an exciting recruitment situation, that being Rosado and Goldneri fleeing for their life trying to reach your group, there isn't. They just reach your group in a cutscene. How much more exciting would it have been if Rosado and Goldneri started out as blue units on the opposite side of the map, or potentially even green units that Hortensia had to reach and talk to as quickly as possible? You know, something similar to FE7 when Lynn's forces are under attack, Thracia when you have the Scrub Squad defending Hannibal's Manor, or FE8 when Dussel is getting attacked by soldiers that do not threaten him whatsoever. It is a false sense of urgency. Dussel is fine. So is this lack of creative recruitments a purely Engage and Fates thing? I would argue once again no. There really have not been that many interesting or fun recruitment situations since Radiant Dawn. Radiant Dawn has 2 red unit recruitables, and there are a handful of green unit recruitables as well, but most of the units that you get in Radiant Dawn just join as blue units at the start of a map or during battle preparations. The same is true of the 3DS games. Three Houses doesn't have any on-map recruitment, everything is handled through the monastery, and then Engage is much the same as Radiant Dawn, Fates, and Awakening were. This seems in large part due to an aversion on the part of Intelligent Systems from having players miss any portion of a game. This is also why, for the most part, recruitable on-map characters can either be recruited by the main lord or someone who also joins you on the map. See also in Fates Revelations, where all the red units you need to recruit are either talking to Corrin or talking to Elise, who joins on the map she recruits them. Heck, we haven't even really had any Aaron and Samson situations where there are mutually exclusive units from each other, unless you count the route splits in Three Houses and Fates, because technically Xander and Ryoma are exclusive from each other, unless you play Revelations. I understand why Intelligent Systems has shied away from having missable content as well. A large number of people in the Fire Emblem fanbase treat full recruitment as if it is mandatory. Any character dying or failing to be recruited is a fail condition. And if that's what your player base wants, and they complain when there are hard to find or hard to recruit characters, it makes sense you would shy away from continuing to add them. Stefan could not exist in a modern Fire Emblem game. Too many people got mad about the fact that he hides on a desert tile with no indication, ignoring that he's clearly meant to be a bonus unit, and not balanced for the point in the game that he joins. It's a secret. Maybe someday I'll make a video on my own issues with the full recruitment mindset, but I do think this in large part contributed to the homogenization of unit recruitment in modern FE. If you don't like that everybody auto-joins now, but you also complained about difficult or obscure recruitments, then I feel like this is a monkey's paw finger curling moment. There is, of course, one other aspect to how the retainers affect Fire Emblem, and that is if everyone's a lord and retainer, it can potentially negatively impact the story. I consider this to be a bigger issue in Fates than Engage, and removing the lord and retainer pattern wouldn't fix everything wrong with Fates' story. But the main reason that I don't like the retainers and lords in Fates is it limits the way the game's support system works. See, thanks to the, for whatever reason, implementation of child units, every male has to be able to support every female unit so that they can have their children. But lords and retainers also all need to be able to support each other, which makes sense. I mean, they gotta have something to talk about. However, this large number of mandatory supports resulted in some characters getting screwed over. Camilla and Leo are definitely the biggest examples of this, since Camilla has 2 female retainers and a sister she has to support, while Leo has 2 male retainers and a brother. Between that and all of the mandatory marriage supports, there's no room for friendships with people like Benny or Charlotte. That being said, I feel like this is less of an issue with the Lords and Retainer system, and more just Fates' support system being stretched unnecessarily by the sloppy child unit implementation. The same thing happens to split route characters like Silas and Kaze, who have to be able to marry tons of different women, and as a result, they don't get to spend as much time with the boys. And if you want another example of Lords and Retainers not being arbitrarily limiting, look no further than Engage, where, because you no longer have to be able to support every opposite gender character, the various retainers are free to gain supports with whomever it makes the most sense for them to support. Rosado supports Goldmurray and Hortensia, which makes sense because his fellow retainer and his employer are people he would have a lot to talk about with, but he also supports Marin because they have the battle of coolness versus cuteness. Panette and Pandreo are siblings, so they support each other. Amber is obsessed with becoming a hero, and Chloe is obsessed with fairy tales, so of course they have rapport with each other as well. And just because characters are retainers doesn't mean that is the entirety of their personality. Both Lapis and Citrine are Alcrest's retainers, and yet Citrine is all about lavish richness, whereas Lapis wrestles bears, and she's actually from a very poor family. Zelkov and Kagetsu could not be more different from each other, and to limit them to just being retainers is reductive to their characterization. At the end of the day, it is easy to point at modern Fire Emblem's casts and say it's all lords and retainers, but I could also point at older Fire Emblems and say it's all soldiers and mercenaries. Makalov and Kirin are technically both Royal Knights of Crimea, but their personalities could not be more different from each other. Anyway, hope you enjoyed this short little video. Like I said, it's kind of just a brainworm that I needed to vomit out onto script, or it would drive me insane. Today's comment code word is potty trained, so make sure you include the phrase potty trained in your comment, that way I know you made it all the way to the end of the video. And now, thank you to my patrons, which includes Michael Krause, Marin McLean, Len, Calamity Callie, Gameboo, Adele, Carosa, Theythom, Fireant, Andu, Smaz Ruby, Reflect, YLO1, Jamie Collins, Mean Jojo, Thick Molder, Arvis, Tailored Muffin, George Grenville the 7th PM, Flohe, Gabe the Green, Control Aegis, Roman Kormancic, Nick Knack Hammersmack, SQP, Caius Cole, Bell Wenska, Dysike, Ginger, Root Beer Pants, Queen Eliza, Aerith Emblem, Lilzabeth, Autumn Kelsey, and Julia Kyoto. If you are interested in supporting the channel, there is a link to my Patreon below. It gets you early access to videos, as well as a couple of other benefits. I'm working on some really big stuff for the month of December, and there's actually a 3.5 hour long video about every lord in the franchise that is available for Patreons now. So, if you are interested in watching that early, consider donating, but please only give if you can comfortably afford to do so. I know that this time of year can be very expensive for people, especially if you celebrate any of the various winter holidays, so do not make yourself go broke over Fire Emblem. I promise it's fine. Regardless of what you choose to do though, I hope you have a wonderful day. Stay safe, gamers.